Government criticized for failing to provide electronic payment system to help residents pay fines for public hygiene offences. President Xi Jinping meets visiting Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. And Israel says its forces have surrounded Gaza City. Hello and welcome to TVB News. The government has come under scrutiny for failing to provide an established electronic payment system to help residents pay fines for public hygiene offences. The criticism by the Food and Environmental Hygiene Department staff rights union comes after the amended fixed penalty ordinance was gazetted last month. Memo Singhai reports.
Under a new ordinance that was enacted in October, the fixed fine for littering and spitting in public areas is now $3,000. Offences such as shopfront extensions and illegal disposal of construction or other types of waste will cost offenders $6,000. In the past, after receiving a penalty bill, residents could pay fines via different channels, including electronic methods such as the Faster Payment System or FPS. However, the Food and Environmental Hygiene Department said online systems cannot be used under the new changes because the payment limit is capped at $1,500. This means individuals must still use conventional methods to pay fines, such as mailing checks or visiting post offices. Vice President of the city's FEHD Staff Rights Union, Lee Mei-Xiu, is disappointed at what she feels is government inadequacy on this matter. The system is not fully established, but the penalty is introduced. I think this shows authorities are not well prepared, she said. Lawmaker Rebecca Chan also described the lack of a proper online payment system as unacceptable. She said the government does not require complicated technology to deliver an updated online payment system. We need to have some improvement in the electronic area, the lawmaker added. Memo 9, TVB News.
The number of residential mortgage loans in negative equity has risen sharply. The chief executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority told TVB News that lenders are subject to strict stress tests, and he is not worried that numerous banks will call in the loans.
Property prices have dropped for the fifth consecutive month. The number of residential mortgage loans in negative equity during the third quarter more than tripled quarter on quarter, surpassing the 11,000 mark. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority, or HKMA, noted there will be changes in the number of such cases depending on property prices. So far, it said the 3-month delinquency rate of residential mortgage loans in negative equity is 0.02%. It believes borrowers are capable of repaying the loans, and when banks are still having a high profit, it is unlikely they will now ask the borrowers to pay back the difference. HKMA Chief Executive Eddie Yu explained mortgage lenders must pass very strict stress tests. He added the situation is not worrying and risks are still under control. In July, HKMA adjusted its counter-cyclical measures for property mortgage loans and relaxed the maximum loan-to-value ratio. Yu noted home prices have already been adjusted downward by over 10% at the time. He said whether or not HKMA will further relax the counter-cyclical measures depends on whether the banking system stability is maintained. When asked how Hong Kong can consolidate its status as a global financial hub, the HKMA chief said the key is to get hold of opportunities in the Greater Bay Area. He said more and more international investors with assets on the mainland need risk management services. Yu added the way forward is to develop fintech and green financing. Sharon Tang, TVB News.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met President Xi Jinping today at Beijing's Great Hall of the People. Albanese met Xi on the first visit by an Australian leader to China in 7 years as the two countries try to mend ties. The talks were expected to focus on trade as China has eased some, but not all, of the restrictive steps it took as relations deteriorated. Before meeting Xi, Albanese stopped by Beijing's Temple of Heaven as he followed in the footsteps of the first Australian leader to visit China, Gough Whitlam, 50 years ago. Albanese hopes relations with China can get back on track after tensions in recent years over issues from security worries to the origin of COVID-19. He said Australia will be upfront, respectful, and will deal through diplomacy. 5 people died, including 2 children, and 6 were injured after a car crashed into an Australian pub's outdoor dining area 100 kilometers northwest of Melbourne. People from the bar ran out to help those crying out in pain. Police in the rural area said their responders witnessed a confronting scene. The 66-year-old driver of the car was taken to a hospital suffering shock and minor injuries. He tested negative for alcohol after careering into the crowded beer garden. Flowers were laid at the scene as those who escaped described it as, quote, horrible. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Turkey as efforts for a diplomatic solution to the Israel-Hamas war grind on. America's top diplomat has seemingly made little progress on his Middle East tour. His presence appears to have stirred up anger, with protests across the region directed at him and Israel. David Garrett with more.
These Iraqis were already furious over Israel's bombardment of Gaza. When they heard the US top diplomat was in Baghdad, levels of anger rose. Blinken's trip to Iraq was not announced prior to arrival. The Iraqi position is broken, this man said. We are humiliated receiving a foreign minister who is controlling the extermination of the Arab-Palestinian nation, he added. Here is Antony Blinken with Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani. Blinken says he offered commitment and support to Iraq. He had been to the US Embassy in Baghdad to gain the latest security information. There, he posed for photos with American troops. US forces in the region have faced attacks by suspected Iranian-backed militia in Iraq and elsewhere. Over the weekend, President Joe Biden had seemed optimistic Blinken could help push for a humanitarian pause in the fighting in Gaza. After being on the ground in Israel, Jordan, the West Bank, Cyprus and Iraq, Blinken was promising little.
This is a process. Israel's raised important questions about how humanitarian pauses would work. We've got to answer those questions. We're working on exactly that. In fact, we agreed that our teams would get together, and they're doing just that, including today, to work through the specifics, the practicalities of these pauses. Second, it's important that the pause advance a number of things. One of them is hostages.
Blinken's tour of diplomacy continues. Next, a 2-day visit to NATO member Turkey, where there have already been widespread protests over both Israel's war on Hamas and Blinken's visit. Demonstrations turned violent outside a US Air Force base in the south. Police had to fight back the crowds with tear gas at Incirlik. Protesters ran for cover and fell on their knees, covering their eyes. The flashpoint came as hundreds of vehicles grouped around the complex. A convoy had set off from Istanbul, nearly 1,000 kilometres away. These were one of many protests across Turkey during the weekend. So Blinken will likely face difficult conversations on this leg of his trip too. Turkey has pulled its ambassador from Israel in recent days. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says he's done with Israel and their leader. David Garrett, TVB News.
Still ahead, the government said to be looking into redeveloping Choi Hung Estate in several phases. A hostage crisis at Hamburg Airport is now over. And bedbug problems spreading in the South Korean capital. Welcome back to TVB News. Sources say the government is looking into demolishing the 60-year-old Choi Hung estate in several phases for redevelopment. Timothy Lee reports.
One of Hong Kong's most iconic public housing estates may fade into the annals of the city's history. The outer wall of Choi Hong Estate was repainted about 10 years ago with colors of the rainbow, giving it its trademark appearance. But much of the vibrancy has faded in recent days. Last year's policy address suggested selecting another public housing estate for redevelopment. Sources say Choi Hong Estate, which was built between 1962 and 1964, was chosen. Reports say the public announcement will be made after the District Council ordinary election at the end of the year. There are currently around 7,400 units at Choi Hong Estate, housing over 17,000 people.
Le
Man Kwang, vice chairman of the Legislative Council panel on housing, predicted more than 10,000 units will be built post-redevelopment. He added it is more cost-effective to rebuild the estate than pay for repairs owing to the occasional falling debris and water leakage problems in old buildings. This, as Federation of Public Housing Estates Executive Director Anthony Chu said Choi Hong Estate will need to be demolished in 2 phases given its large size. In the past, a number of residents of Cheung Sha Wan's So Oak Estate, which began redevelopment in 2012, temporarily resided in newly built public housing units at nearby Un Chau Estate. Meanwhile, the redevelopment plan for Wafu Estate was announced in 2014. But demolition of the old buildings would only begin until some of its residents are housed in new units at nearby estates. And the whole redevelopment project would take 27 years to complete. Lawmaker Tan Ka-pew said authorities could learn from previous examples and settle a partial number of residents during the redevelopment process. He added the public housing estate should continue to keep a suitable amount of outdoor exercising facilities and Choi Hong Estate's iconic features after redevelopment. Earlier, Secretary for Housing Winnie Ho stressed the government is still selecting old public housing estates and will publicly announce them later. She said there are 10 redevelopment projects currently ongoing under the Housing Authority. Timothy Lee, TVB News.
The 3-day Global Financial Leaders Investment Summit in the city got underway today. Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Eddie Yu, hopes the event can showcase the city's strengths and attract more investments in the long run. Some 300 financial leaders are expected to gather for the occasion. More than 90 people holding the rank of CEO or chairman are expected to attend. That's more than double last year's figure. HKMA Chief Executive Eddie Yu told TVB News that the event last year was well received, so much so that it's hard to obtain entry into this year's summit. He also doesn't rule out holding the summit on a regular basis. TVB Pearl will broadcast the Global Financial Leaders Investment Summit live starting at 8:25 a.m. tomorrow. A man working on board a vessel at New Yau Ma Tei typhoon shelter died after falling from a height. At around noon, police received a report that a 58-year-old man was unconscious with head injuries. He was suspected to have tripped and fallen from height. Marine police arrived at the scene and brought the man ashore. He was then sent to Kwang Wah Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Authorities plan to increase the profits tax deduction of mandatory Provident Fund voluntary contributions in the first quarter of next year for employers of employees aged 65 or above in a bid to encourage the former to retain elderly staff. The government's proposal to the Legislative Council suggested increasing the 100% profits tax deduction to 200%. But some lawmakers noted their concern over the effectiveness of the measure.
If you offer 200% tax deduction for employers, why don't you offer the same tax deduction for employees? After abolishing the offsetting mechanism, you want to instill confidence in the public that the returns are actually quite good, such as the core funds.
A hostage situation lasting 18 hours came to an end at Hamburg Airport. A man was arrested after taking his young child and breaking through the perimeter, disrupting flights through Saturday night and Sunday. The Army were called in after a 35-year-old drove through security and holed up with a 4-year-old on the tarmac. Reports say he parked under a Turkish Airlines plane. He fired shots from a gun and threw burning bottles out of the window. No one was injured. After speaking with psychologists, he gave himself up and was apprehended. Police say he's fighting a custody battle. Hundreds waiting for flights had to go to hotels. Authorities in Seoul are racing to control the spread of bedbugs after 17 such infestations had been reported in the South Korean capital as of Sunday. Seoul has set aside $500 million to prevent bedbug infestations from spreading. Authorities plan to inspect over 3,000 public facilities, including hotels and public bathhouses, to check hygiene management. Bedbugs were believed to have been eradicated in South Korea by the 1970s after trucks were sprayed a pesticide throughout the country. But reports of bedbugs began to surface in mid-September after a student was reportedly bitten by the parasites in a dorm room at a university in Daegu City. The authorities believe that increased overseas traveling following the lifting of COVID travel restrictions may have played a part in the current outbreak. That is the news. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.